In February 2018, my coworker Jake convinced a group of us to join him for a weekend retreat at a remote lodge in the Rockies. It was supposed to be a team-building trip, but really, it was just an excuse to take a break from work and enjoy some skiing and snowboarding. There were 5 of us, me, Jake, our supervisor Lauren, and 2 other co-workers, Emily and Steve. The lodge was miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding road that snaked through dense forest. When we arrived, the place looked straight out of a postcard: log walls, a steep, snow-covered roof, and a large stone fireplace visible through the front windows. It was surrounded by towering pine trees, their branches heavy with fresh snow. But something about the lodge felt off from the moment we stepped inside. The interior was beautiful: high ceilings, polished wood floors, and a massive fireplace that roared to life when Jake lit it. But the air felt heavy, like the place had been holding its breath. There were no staff around, just a note on the counter welcoming us and explaining that the lodge was self-service. Food was stocked in the kitchen, and keys to the rooms were hanging by the door. We picked our rooms and unpacked, laughing and joking as we explored the space. But as we settled in, little things began to bother me. The rooms were immaculate, yet the place felt unused. There were no personal touches, no sense that anyone had ever stayed there before us. And then there was the silence. Even with 5 of us talking and laughing, the lodge seemed unnaturally quiet. The walls absorbed sound, muting our voices and footsteps. Outside, the snow fell in a steady, suffocating hush. It felt like the whole world had been muted. That first night, we gathered in the main room by the fireplace, drinking wine and playing board games. The warmth of the fire and the glow of the lanterns made the lodge feel almost cozy, and for a while, I forgot about the strange atmosphere. Until Emily pointed out the window. "Is someone out there?" she asked, her voice breaking the laughter. We turned to look. The window was fogged from the heat of the fire, but in the faint light of the lanterns outside, we could see a shape, a dark figure standing at the edge of the tree line. "Probably just a skier," Jake said, though his tone lacked confidence. "Why would a skier be out there this late?" Lauren asked. No one had an answer. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the light or our presence. It just stood there, watching. We decided to lock the doors and call it a night, though none of us slept well. I kept hearing noises, soft creaks and faint footsteps, like someone walking through the halls. Twice, I got up to check, but each time, the lodge was empty. The next morning, the figure was gone, and we tried to convince ourselves it had been a trick of the light. We spent the day skiing and snowboarding, the crisp mountain air and bright sunshine lifting our spirits. But when we returned to the lodge that evening, the unease crept back in. It started with the whispers. We were in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when Steve froze, tilting his head as if listening. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" Jake said, "Chopping vegetables." "Voices," Steve said. "Coming from upstairs." We all stopped and listened. At first, I heard nothing, but then it came, a faint, indistinct murmuring, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. It was so soft that I thought I might be imagining it, but the look on everyone else's faces told me they heard it too. Jake and I volunteered to check upstairs. The whispers grew louder as we climbed the stairs, though we still couldn't make out any words. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the snow through the windows. We checked every room, but they were all empty. The whispers stopped as soon as we reached the top of the stairs, leaving only the heavy silence. When we returned to the kitchen, the others were visibly shaken. Lauren, usually calm and composed, was pacing nervously. Emily was staring out the window, her face pale. "He's back," she said. We joined her at the window. The figure was there again, closer this time, standing in the middle of the snow-covered yard. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the shadows. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. "I'm calling the lodge owner," Lauren said, grabbing her phone. But there was no signal. The Wi-Fi, which had worked fine earlier, was suddenly down. We were completely cut off. That night, the lodge came alive. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, echoing through the halls like a chorus of disembodied voices. Footsteps creaked on the floor above us, even though we were all gathered in the living room. The fireplace, which had been roaring all evening, suddenly extinguished itself, plunging us into darkness. Jake lit a lantern, his hands shaking. "We need to get out of here," he said. "But where would we go?" Lauren asked. "It's a blizzard out there." As we argued, the footsteps descended the stairs. They were slow and deliberate, each step sending a jolt of fear through me. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, though there was no one there. And then the front door slammed open. The wind howled through the doorway, scattering snow across the floor. In the chaos, the lantern flickered and went out, leaving us in darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I turned it on, the beam illuminated something I'll never forget. The figure was inside. It was taller than I'd imagined, its body unnaturally elongated, its face a blur of shadows and shifting features. It stood in the doorway, its head tilting as it seemed to survey us. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing my arm. We bolted through the back door, not stopping to grab our coats or gear. The snow was deep and freezing, but fear propelled us forward. Behind us, the lodge stood silent and dark, the figure watching from the doorway. We made it to the car, our breaths visible in the icy air. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling, as the rest of us kept glancing back at the lodge. When the engine roared to life, we didn't wait for it to warm up, we sped down the snow-covered road, slipping and skidding as we fled. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, where we collapsed into a diner and tried to make sense of what had happened. But there were no answers, no explanations, just the lingering terror of what we'd seen. We never went back to that lodge. Jake tried to contact the owner later, but the number had been disconnected, and the listing disappeared from the rental site. To this day, I don't know what was in that lodge or why it had been waiting for us. But sometimes, on cold winter nights, I think I hear whispers in the wind, faint and distant, calling me back. And I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. In the winter of 2016, my friends and I decided to rent a lakeside cabin for a week of ice fishing and relaxation. It was a tradition we'd started in college, a way to reconnect and escape the grind of adult life. This year, we chose a remote spot in northern Wisconsin, far from the touristy lodges and noisy snowmobilers. The lake was enormous, frozen solid under a thick layer of ice, surrounded by dense woods that muffled the sounds of the world. It was the kind of place where the silence was so profound you could hear your own heartbeat. There were 6 of us, me, my best friend Nate, his younger brother Sam, and our friends Chris, Mark, and Dave. The cabin itself was rustic but comfortable, perched on a slight hill overlooking the lake. The first few days were perfect, clear skies, good fishing, and a few beers around the fire each night. But by the 3rd night, the weather began to turn. A storm rolled in, bringing heavy snow and bitter winds. That's when things started to get strange. It began with a sound. We were sitting around the fire in the cabin, laughing and swapping stories, when we heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was so soft at first that we almost didn't notice, blending with the creak of the old wood and the howl of the wind outside. "What's that?" Sam asked, his voice breaking the easy flow of conversation. "Probably just the storm," Nate said, though he didn't sound convinced. We brushed it off and went to bed, but the tapping continued, faint but insistent, like something or someone was out there, trying to get in. The next morning, we found footprints in the snow around the cabin. They were strange, large and oddly spaced, as if whoever made them had been limping or dragging one leg. They circled the cabin several times before disappearing out onto the ice. "Maybe it's a bear," Chris suggested, though none of us had ever seen tracks like that before. "Bears hibernate in winter," Mark pointed out. The footprints made us uneasy, but we tried to laugh it off, joking about Bigfoot and telling ghost stories as we set up our fishing gear on the ice. That afternoon, while drilling holes for the lines, Sam said he thought he heard voices. "You guys hear that?" he asked, standing still, his head cocked to one side. "Hear what?" I asked, stopping to listen. He pointed toward the lake. "It's faint, but it sounds like people. Like they're under the ice." We all stopped to listen, but the only sound was the wind whipping across the frozen expanse. "You're imagining things," Nate said, clapping his brother on the back. But I wasn't so sure. That night, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder, more deliberate, like someone knocking on the walls of the cabin. We gathered in the living room, nervously glancing at the windows. The storm had intensified, the snow falling so heavily that we could barely see the lake through the glass. "We should check it out," Chris said, grabbing a flashlight. "Are you insane?" Mark shot back. "It's a blizzard out there." But Chris was stubborn. He pulled on his coat and boots and stepped outside, leaving the door ajar. The cold wind howled through the opening, and we huddled around it, waiting for him to return. He came back a few minutes later, his face pale and his eyes wide. "You guys need to see this," he said, his voice shaking. We followed him outside, bracing against the biting wind. He led us to the edge of the lake, where the snow had been swept away in strange, swirling patterns. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw them, words scratched into the surface of the ice. "Help us." The writing was crude, as if made with fingernails or a jagged rock. It stretched across the ice in uneven, desperate lines. "Who would do this?" Nate asked, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Maybe it's a prank," Mark said, though his voice was uncertain. Sam knelt down to touch the words, running his fingers over the grooves. "They're deep," he said. "Whoever did this had to be out here for a while." The idea of someone kneeling on the ice in the middle of a storm, scratching out words with frozen hands, sent a chill down my spine. That night, none of us slept well. The tapping continued, now accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The storm raged outside, and the cabin felt smaller, its walls closing in around us. I kept thinking about the writing on the ice and the footprints that led out onto the lake. At some point, I drifted into a fitful sleep, only to be jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. We all rushed to the living room, where Sam was standing by the window, his face pale and his hands trembling. "There's someone out there," he said, pointing toward the lake. We crowded around the window, squinting through the snow. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, in the faint moonlight, I saw them, figures standing on the ice, motionless, their shapes blurred by the storm. "Is it people?" Chris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think so," Nate said. The figures didn't move, didn't react to the wind or the cold. They just stood there, silent and still, like shadows frozen in time. Then, as we watched, they began to sink, disappearing into the ice as if the frozen surface had opened up to swallow them. We didn't wait to see more. We barricaded the doors and windows, building the fire as high as we could and sitting in terrified silence until dawn. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving a pristine layer of snow over the lake. There were no footprints, no writing, no sign of the figures we'd seen the night before. But as we packed up to leave, we found something that made my blood run cold. A handprint. It was pressed against the outside of the cabin window, its outline sharp and distinct, the fingers long and impossibly thin. We left that day, abandoning our gear and cutting the trip short. None of us spoke on the drive back to the city. The memory of those figures on the ice and the handprint at the window burned into our minds. To this day, I don't know what we encountered on that lake. But every winter, when the snow falls and the world grows quiet, I think about the whispers beneath the ice and the figures that vanished into the frozen depths. And I wonder if they're still there, waiting for someone else to see them. In December 2017, I took a job in a small town nestled in the snowy mountains of Montana. The town was remote, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and visitors were rare. To get there, I had to take a train that passed through miles of dense forest and frozen rivers, with only the occasional stop at small, desolate stations. The job was temporary, just a 3-month stint as a surveyor for a new power line project. My employer provided housing in a small cabin on the outskirts of town. It wasn't luxurious, but it was cozy enough, and the solitude was something I'd been craving after years in the city. The journey started normally. I boarded the train at a bustling station in Seattle, settling into a window seat with a book and a thermos of coffee. The car was mostly empty, save for a couple of older men in heavy coats and a woman with a child bundled in layers of scarves. As the train pulled out of the station, I watched the city fade into the distance, replaced by the endless expanse of snow-covered wilderness. The first few hours were uneventful. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks and the occasional announcement over the intercom created a soothing backdrop as I read. But as night fell, the atmosphere began to change. The train car grew colder, despite the heaters humming faintly beneath the seats. The passengers, who had been quietly chatting or napping, seemed tense now, their eyes darting toward the windows as if expecting to see something out there in the dark. At one point, the woman with the child stood up and approached the conductor, who had just entered our car to check tickets. She spoke to him in hushed tones, glancing nervously over her shoulder. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but her expression was enough to unsettle me. The conductor nodded, his face serious, and whispered something back to her before moving on. When he reached my seat, I asked him if everything was all right. "Just a bit of a rough stretch ahead," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Nothing to worry about." The train slowed as we approached a small, snow-covered station. It wasn't one of the scheduled stops listed on my ticket, and I hadn't noticed it on the route map. The station was eerily empty, the platform buried in fresh snow, with no sign of life. The conductor stepped off the train, but no one boarded. After a few minutes, we continued on our way. That's when I noticed the man. He was seated a few rows ahead of me, a tall, thin figure in a dark coat and hat that cast his face in shadow. I was sure he hadn't been there earlier. His seat had been empty when we left the last station. He didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, just sat there with his head slightly tilted, as if listening. The woman with the child noticed him too. She clutched her child tighter, whispering frantically to him in a language I didn't understand. The older men exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. The train entered a tunnel, plunging us into darkness. The lights in the car flickered, and for a moment, everything was bathed in an eerie, stuttering glow. When the light stabilized, the man was gone. I stared at his empty seat, my heart pounding. No one else seemed to notice his disappearance, or if they did, they pretended not to. The tension in the car was palpable now, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. "Did you see him leave?" I asked one of the older men. He shook his head, his face pale. Best not to ask questions. The train continued through the night, the trees outside blurring into indistinct shapes. I tried to distract myself by reading, but my eyes kept drifting back to the empty seat where the men had been. Around midnight, the train slowed again, coming to a stop in the middle of nowhere. There was no station, no platform, just an expanse of snow stretching out into the dark. The intercom crackled, and the conductor's voice came on, strained and uneasy. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be stopping here for a short while. Please remain in your seats." The woman with the child began to cry softly. The older men muttered to each other in low voices. I leaned toward the window, trying to see what was happening, but the snow outside was too thick, swirling in the wind like a living thing. Then I saw him, the man in the dark coat, standing on the tracks just ahead of the train. His head was tilted again, as if listening, and his hands hung loosely at his sides. The snow didn't seem to touch him, and his figure was unnaturally sharp against the blurred background. The train car grew colder, frost creeping along the windows despite the heaters. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the man was inside the car, seated in the same spot as before. This time, everyone noticed. The older men stood abruptly, muttering prayers under their breath. The woman with the child clutched her son and began to back away, her eyes wide with terror. The men didn't move, didn't even acknowledge the chaos around him. He just sat there, silent and still. The conductor appeared at the end of the car, his face pale and glistening with sweat. He approached the men cautiously, his hands trembling as he held out a ticket. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking. "You need to leave." The man tilted his head slowly, as if considering the request. Then he stood, his movements unnaturally smooth, and walked toward the end of the car. The passengers pressed themselves against the walls to avoid him, their breaths visible in the freezing air. He stepped through the door into the next car, and the tension in the room broke like a dam. The woman with the child began sobbing, the older men sank back into their seats, and the conductor collapsed into a chair, his hands shaking. "What was that?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. The conductor didn't answer. He just shook his head, muttering to himself. "Not supposed to stop here, not supposed to let him on." The train didn't stop again until we reached my destination. By the time we pulled into the station, the car was nearly empty. The woman and her child were gone, as were the older men. Only the conductor and I remained. As I stepped off the train, I glanced back at the car. The man in the dark coat was sitting in his seat again, his head tilted toward the window. He raised a hand, not to wave, but as if to beckon. I turned away and never looked back. To this day, I don't know what I saw on that train or who, or what, that man was. But sometimes, on cold winter nights, I dream of the rhythmic clatter of the tracks and the man's shadowy figure, waiting for his next stop. It was December 2020 when my girlfriend, Tessa, and I decided to escape the chaos of the city and spend a quiet weekend in the mountains. We rented a small cabin near an icy, snow-covered lake. The photos online showed a charming wooden structure surrounded by towering pine trees, the lake shimmering like a postcard in the background. It seemed perfect, peaceful, private, and picturesque. The cabin itself was cozy, with a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a large picture window that overlooked the lake. Tessa was thrilled, snapping photos of every corner while I unloaded the car. The snow was falling lightly, and the air was crisp, the kind of winter scene you'd see on a holiday card. But as I stood by the car, taking in the view, something across the lake caught my eye, a second cabin, partially hidden among the trees. It was smaller, more weathered, with no visible signs of life. I wouldn't have thought much of it, but the window on the front of the cabin seemed to reflect the light oddly, almost like it was watching. We spent the first evening settling in. Tessa cooked dinner while I got the fire going, and we played board games until late. The storm picked up, snow falling heavier now, but we were warm and comfortable inside. As we got ready for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't entirely alone. I glanced out the large picture window at the lake, but the other cabin was barely visible through the snow. "Do you think anyone lives over there?" I asked, nodding toward the distant silhouette. Tessa shrugged. "It looks abandoned." "Why?" I hesitated. "No reason. Just curious." That night, I woke to a strange noise. It was faint at first, like a soft thud against the side of the cabin. I sat up, listening intently as my heart began to race. The noise came again, closer this time, more deliberate. "Tessa," I whispered, shaking her awake. "What is it?" she mumbled, still half asleep. "I heard something outside." She groaned, pulling the blankets over her head. "It's probably just the wind." But it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like footsteps crunching in the snow, circling the cabin. I got up, grabbed the flashlight we'd left by the door, and cautiously peeked outside. The snow was still falling, but in the faint glow of the porch light, I could see footprints, fresh ones, leading around the side of the cabin and toward the lake. I followed the trail with my flashlight until it disappeared into the darkness. The other cabin was barely visible now, but as I stared at it, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of movement in the window. The next morning, I told Tessa what I'd seen. She dismissed it as a bad dream, but I could tell she was a little uneasy. We spent the day exploring the area, walking along the frozen lake and taking photos of the snowy landscape. The other cabin loomed in the distance, silent and still, its dark windows like empty eyes. "Let's check it out," I suggested, trying to sound casual. "Why?" Tessa asked, frowning. "It's probably just an old storage shed or something. Don't you want to see if it's abandoned?" She hesitated but eventually agreed, and we made our way across the frozen lake. The snow was deep, and the air was bitterly cold, our breaths visible in the icy air. As we got closer, the cabin came into focus. It was smaller than ours, with weathered wood and a sagging roof. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking faintly in the wind. "Hello," I called out, stepping onto the porch. There was no response, just the eerie sound of the wind whistling through the trees. Inside, the cabin was empty, or so it seemed. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But something felt off. The air was heavy, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should have been. "Let's go," Tessa said, tugging on my arm. "This place gives me the creeps." We returned to our cabin, but the unease stayed with us. That night, as the storm raged outside, the sound started again. It was the same as before, soft thuds and the crunch of footsteps in the snow. But this time, it was louder, closer. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door, my breath catching as I stepped onto the porch. The footprints were back, but they weren't just circling the cabin, they led directly to the window. I followed the trail with the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The footprints stopped abruptly in front of the picture window, but there was no sign of anyone there. I turned back toward the lake, and that's when I saw it, the cabin across the water, its single window glowing faintly with a dim, flickering light. "Tessa," I called out, my voice shaking. "Come here." She joined me on the porch, her face pale as she stared at the distant light. "There's someone over there," she whispered. "We need to check it out," I said. We bundled up and made our way back across the frozen lake, the flashlight cutting through the swirling snow. As we approached the cabin, the light in the window disappeared. The door, which we'd left slightly open earlier, was now shut tight. Inside, the cabin was as empty as before, but the air was even colder, the silence even heavier. I scanned the room with the flashlight, my pulse racing as the beam landed on something that hadn't been there earlier, a single chair, positioned in the middle of the room, facing the door. "What is that?" Tessa whispered, clutching my arm. Before I could respond, a loud crash echoed from the corner of the room. We spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. A shadow darted across the wall, impossibly fast, disappearing through the open door. We didn't wait to see more. We ran back to our cabin, locking the door behind us and pushing the couch in front of it for good measure. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and sleeplessness. We stayed by the fire, the flashlight clutched tightly in my hand, jumping at every sound. When morning finally came, the footprints around our cabin had multiplied, circling it over and over before leading back across the lake. We left that day, cutting our trip short. As we drove away, I glanced back at the other cabin. The door was open again, swinging slowly in the wind. And in the window, just for a moment, I thought I saw a figure watching us leave. I still think about the cabin sometimes, about the footsteps in the shadow and the chair in the middle of the room. I don't know what we encountered that weekend, but I do know one thing: whatever it wasn't alone. And neither were we. In January of 2019, I agreed to join my Uncle Paul on a weekend ice fishing trip in northern Minnesota. I'd never been ice fishing before, and honestly, I wasn't thrilled about the idea of spending hours freezing in a shanty on a frozen lake. But Paul had always been like a second father to me, and after my recent breakup, he thought the trip would be a good distraction. We left early on a Friday morning, driving for hours through desolate stretches of snow-covered forest until we reached the small, isolated cabin he'd rented near Blackwood Lake. The cabin was simple but functional, just a single room with a wood stove, a couple of bunks, and a small table. It sat at the edge of the lake, which stretched out like a vast sheet of glass under the pale winter sun. "This is real solitude," Paul said, smiling as he unloaded the gear. "No cell service, no distractions. Just the lake and us." That first day was uneventful. Paul showed me how to drill holes in the ice, set up the lines, and wait patiently for a bite. The lake was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, pressing against your ears. By the time the sun set, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees and whipping across the ice. Back at the cabin, we lit a fire and settled in for the night. Paul shared stories about his past fishing trips, but I couldn't focus. Something about the lake had unsettled me. It felt too empty, too still, as if it were holding its breath. Around midnight, I woke to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was a low, rhythmic tapping. It seemed to be coming from the window. "Paul." I whispered, but he was sound asleep in the bunk across the room. I got up, my breath visible in the cold air, and approached the window. The tapping stopped as I drew closer. I peered outside, but the darkness was impenetrable, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon reflecting off the ice. Then, just at the edge of the tree line, I saw it, a figure. It was hard to make out details, but the figure was tall and hunched, its silhouette stark against the snow. It didn't move, didn't react to my presence. I stared for what felt like an eternity before backing away from the window and climbing back into my bunk, pulling the blankets over my head like a child afraid of monsters under the bed. I told myself it was just a trick of the shadows, a tree or a stray branch catching the moonlight. But sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Paul noticed I was unusually quiet. "Didn't sleep well?" he asked. "I thought I heard something last night," I admitted. "Probably just the wind." Paul laughed. "This place can get to you if you're not used to it. Nothing out there but snow and trees." I wanted to believe him, so I pushed the memory of the figure to the back of my mind. We spent the day on the lake, but the unease lingered. Every now and then, I caught myself glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see the figure again. That night, the tapping returned. This time, Paul heard it too. He sat up in his bunk, his face serious as he listened. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "Wait, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Probably just a branch hitting the cabin," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. He opened the door, the cold air rushing in, and stepped outside. I watched from the window as he swept the flashlight across the snow, but there was nothing there. No branches, no tracks, no sign of anything that could have made the noise. Paul came back inside, locking the door behind him. "Probably the wind," he said, but his expression was tense. We both stayed awake after that, sitting by the fire in uneasy silence. The wind outside grew stronger, and the cabin creaked under the pressure. Around 3 a.m., we heard it again, the tapping, louder this time, more insistent. Paul grabbed his shotgun, motioning for me to stay behind as he opened the door once more. But this time, he didn't step outside. He just stood there, staring out into the night. "Paul," I whispered. "What is it?" He didn't answer. His grip on the shotgun tightened, his knuckles white. I followed his gaze and saw it, the figure, closer now, standing at the edge of the frozen lake. It was taller than I'd thought, its body impossibly thin, draped in tattered, dark fabric that fluttered in the wind. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, piercing through the darkness. "Get inside," Paul said, his voice low and urgent. "What is that?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "Now," he barked. We slammed the door and barricaded it with the table and chairs. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if the figure were circling the cabin, testing its defenses. The fire flickered, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls, and the air grew colder despite the heat. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. We didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally broke, we stepped outside cautiously, our boots crunching in the snow. The lake was empty, the figure gone, but the snow around the cabin was disturbed, as if something had walked back and forth repeatedly. What struck me most were the tracks on the lake. They led to the center of the frozen expanse, where they stopped abruptly, as if whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. We packed up and left that morning, cutting the trip short. Paul tried to rationalize what we'd seen, but I could tell he was shaken. I never went ice fishing again, and I've avoided isolated cabins ever since. Sometimes, in the dead of winter, I think about that figure on the lake. I wonder what it wanted, why it was watching us. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to notice it in the darkness. When I was 19, my friends and I planned a winter trip to celebrate the new year. We rented a secluded cabin in the mountains, far from the city lights and traffic. It sounded like the perfect way to escape the chaos of life, ring in the new year with close friends, and maybe even spot some wildlife. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Luke, his girlfriend Maria, her brother Jamie, and Sarah, who had been Maria's childhood friend. The drive was scenic but treacherous. Snow had started falling early that morning, and by the time we reached the base of the mountain, the storm had intensified. The road was narrow, the kind that felt like one wrong turn could send you tumbling into a ravine. Luke, ever the thrill-seeker, insisted he could handle the conditions. I was less sure, but we eventually reached the cabin just as darkness settled over the woods. The cabin was rustic but cozy, with a wood-burning stove and large windows that offered stunning views of the snowy forest. After unpacking and starting a fire, we settled into the living room with mugs of hot chocolate and the promise of a relaxing weekend. The first strange thing happened just after dinner. Luke had gone outside to bring in more firewood. He returned with a puzzled expression, saying he'd found fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the back of the cabin. We hadn't seen anyone else on the way up, and the nearest house was miles away. Probably a hiker who got lost, Sarah suggested, but even she sounded unsure. The footprints weren't the kind you'd expect from hiking boots, they were bare feet. They trailed to the back porch but stopped abruptly, as if the person had vanished. We joked nervously about ghosts and serial killers to break the tension, but no one laughed for long. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, like someone dragging a heavy object across the porch. I sat up, straining to listen. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of the dying fire in the living room. The sound came again, this time accompanied by a soft tapping on the glass. I tiptoed to the window and peered outside. The storm had intensified, making it hard to see, but there was a shadow, a figure standing just beyond the porch light. They weren't moving, just watching. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, waking Jamie in the process. By the time we both looked again, the figure was gone. The next morning, we found more footprints, bare feet trailing through the snow, circling the cabin. They were erratic, as if whoever made them had stumbled or limped. We followed them into the woods, but they ended abruptly at the base of a tree, with no indication of where the person had gone. "That's impossible," Maria said, hugging herself against the cold. "No one could survive out here barefoot in this weather." Luke suggested we let it go, but none of us could shake the unease. We spent the day inside, keeping the fire roaring and sticking close together. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the isolation began to feel oppressive. That evening, things escalated. We were playing cards when the power cut out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Luke grabbed a flashlight, and we huddled by the fire, trying to keep calm. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but it was the heavy thud on the roof that froze us in place. "What was that?" Sarah whispered. Luke shone the flashlight toward the ceiling. We held our breath as the thudding moved, deliberate and heavy, toward the edge of the cabin. Then it stopped. A sudden crash shattered the silence. One of the windows had broken. Snow and wind poured into the living room as we scrambled to block the opening. That's when Jamie screamed. The figure was back, standing in the shadows just beyond the broken window. Its features were obscured, but the height, the broad shoulders, the way it tilted its head unnaturally, it was all wrong. Luke shouted, grabbing the fire poker and running toward the door, but when he flung it open, there was nothing there. No footprints in the snow, no sign anyone had been there at all. The rest of the night was a blur of fear. We barricaded the windows and doors, taking turns keeping watch. The sounds continued, footsteps on the porch, tapping on the glass, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. By the time dawn broke, we were exhausted and on edge. We packed up and left as soon as it was light, abandoning food, clothes, and anything we couldn't carry. The drive down the mountain was tense, every shadow in the trees making us jump. We never talked about what happened that night, not really. Luke tried to rationalize it, blaming the storm and our imaginations. But I know what I saw. And every New Year's Eve, I think about that figure in the snow, standing just outside the window, waiting for something.